Imagine a republic built on centuries of tradition and law, yet groaning under the weight of its own success. In the final century before Christ, Rome had conquered an empire, but its ancient political system struggled to contain the immense power now held by its ambitious generals and wealthy elite. The stage was set for a dramatic conflict, not just between factions, but between the republic's very ideals and the rise of individual titans. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the story of Rome's great civil war unfold. If you enjoy this kind of deep, long-form history that you can relax or even fall asleep to, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It helps us tremendously. We'd also love to see you in the comments. Let us know how long you plan on listening with us tonight. It gives us a great sense of our community. Now, let's begin our story. The Roman Republic was, on paper, a masterpiece of shared power. You had the Senate, a council of the most experienced and powerful men in the state, who guided policy. You had the people's assemblies, where citizens could vote on laws and elect officials. And you had those officials, the magistrates, who served for just 1 year, preventing any single person from holding power for too long. For centuries, this system had worked. It had allowed Rome to grow from a small city-state into the master of Italy. But the machine was starting to break down. As Rome's legions marched further and further, conquering lands from Spain to Syria, vast new wealth flooded into the city. This wealth, however, didn't flow to everyone. It created a massive gap between the incredibly rich and the desperately poor. The small farms that were the backbone of the old republic were being bought up by wealthy landowners, leaving thousands of ordinary Romans landless and with few prospects. Corruption became common. The rules that worked for a city were not working for an empire. And this created a new, dangerous dynamic. Power began to shift away from the political halls of the Senate and into the military camps of its generals. Ambitious men, sent to conquer new territories, found that their soldiers became more loyal to them personally than to the state back in Rome. After all, it was the general who led them to victory, who secured their plunder, and who promised them land upon retirement. This was a dangerous precedent. Decades earlier, generals like Marius and Sulla had already shown what could happen when a commander marched his personal army on Rome itself. They had torn the Republic apart in their own civil war, and though the Republic survived, the scars remained. The lesson was clear: a man with a loyal army could bend the state to his will. Into this tense and shifting world stepped Gnaeus Pompeius, a man who would become known as Pompey the Great. From a young age, Pompey was a military prodigy. He wasn't from one of the oldest, most prestigious families, but his talent was undeniable. He first rose to fame as a commander under the dictator Sulla, earning a reputation for skill and ruthlessness. But he quickly outgrew his mentor's shadow. Rome gave him one impossible task after another, and he succeeded every time. When pirates ruled the Mediterranean, disrupting trade and threatening Rome's food supply, the people gave Pompey unprecedented power to solve the problem. He did it in just 3 months. When a powerful king in the east, Mithridates, threatened Rome's borders for decades, it was Pompey who was sent to finish the job. He not only defeated the king, but reorganized the entire eastern frontier, adding vast new territories and client kingdoms to Rome's empire. He returned to Rome as the undisputed military hero of his age. he celebrated a triumph so magnificent it lasted for 2 days. He had more wealth, more prestige, and more military glory than any Roman alive. To many, especially in the Senate, he was the model Roman, a brilliant general who brought glory and riches to the Republic. Pompey, adorned with the title Magnus the Great, was Rome's undisputed military hero, a man whose triumphs had expanded the Republic's borders and filled its coffers. He stood as the epitome of Roman military success, a formidable figure in an age of change. He seemed to be the guardian of the old ways, the strong man who could keep the creaking system together. The Republic, however, was a churning sea of ambition, and another figure, seemingly less traditional, was already charting his own course. How would this rising star navigate the turbulent waters of Roman politics, and how would his path inevitably cross with that of the mighty Pompey? Their paths would cross not on a battlefield, at least not yet, but in the shadowy corridors of power. In the turbulent waters of the late Republic, even rivals could find common ground, not of friendship, but of pure, calculated need. The two most powerful men in Rome, Caesar and Pompey, along with the fabulously wealthy Crassus, would set aside their growing resentments to form a secret pact that would reshape Roman politics forever. Each of these titans, despite their individual strengths, faced frustrating obstacles from the entrenched Roman aristocracy. Imagine Pompey the Great, the conqueror of the East, fresh from his victories and celebrated by the people. And yet, the Senate, jealous of his power and popularity, was stonewalling him. They refused to formally approve the new political arrangements he had made in the Eastern territories. And even more importantly, they refused to grant the farmland he had promised to his loyal veteran soldiers. For a man of Pompey's stature, this was a deep personal insult. He felt unappreciated and undermined. Then there was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was, by a huge margin, the richest man in Rome. His wealth was legendary, but money alone didn't buy the kind of respect or military glory that Pompey had. Crassus craved political influence equal to his financial power, and he often found himself blocked by the same old noble families who looked down on his purely commercial success. And finally, there was Caesar. After his year as governor in Spain, he had returned to Rome with new ambitions, but also with crushing debt. To truly rise to the top, to be seen as an equal to Pompey, he needed two things. First, the highest office in the Republic, the consulship. And second, after his year as consul, he needed a long-term military command in a province where he could win glory, conquer territory, and build a loyal army of his own. The Senate, however, saw his ambition and was determined to stop him. So, in the year 60 BCE, these three men made a secret deal. It was not a formal, legal arrangement. It was a private pact, a handshake agreement to combine their strengths and get what each of them wanted. Contemporaries, horrified by this backroom deal, would later call it the monstrous three-headed beast. Pompey brought his immense military prestige and his thousands of loyal veterans. Crassus brought his bottomless reserves of cash to fund campaigns and bribe officials. And Caesar brought his sharp political mind and his deep connection to the common people of Rome. Together, they would be unstoppable. This was a power-sharing agreement, unlike any Rome had seen. A backroom deal between three ambitious men, pooling their resources to dictate the Republic's affairs, often to the dismay of the traditional Senate. The first test of their new alliance was Caesar's campaign for consul. With Pompey's and Crassus's backing, he won easily, and during his year in office in 59 BCE, he was ruthless. With the triumvirate's backing, Caesar bulldozed his way through his consulship. He immediately passed the laws that the Senate had denied Pompey, finally giving land to his veterans and ratifying his eastern settlements. He pushed through financial legislation that benefited Crassus's business allies. And most importantly, he secured for himself the grand prize he so desperately wanted, a 5-year command as governor over the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, and with that command came for legions. This was the essential springboard for his own ambitions. A long-term command in Gaul, where he would forge an army and a legend. The uneasy alliance of the triumvirate had reshaped Rome, but it was a pact held together by ambition and convenience, not trust. As Caesar embarked on his momentous campaigns in Gaul, the delicate balance of power would shift, and the seeds of a fatal fracture would begin to sprout between him and Pompey. What monumental challenges would Caesar face in Gaul, and how would his triumphs inadvertently push him towards an inevitable collision course with his old ally? Beyond the familiar borders of Rome lay Gaul, a vast, untamed land of diverse Celtic tribes, fiercely independent and often hostile. For Caesar, this was his crucible, a decade-long campaign that would transform a politically ambitious orator into Rome's most feared and celebrated military genius. Here, he would forge an army whose loyalty was unquestioning, and a legend that would echo through history. When Caesar arrived, Gaul was not a single unified country. It was a patchwork of hundreds of different tribes, sometimes allies, often bitter enemies. It was a land of dense, dark forests, treacherous rivers, and fortified hill forts. His official mission was to defend Rome's existing provinces and protect its allies from migrating tribes. But Caesar, ever the opportunist, saw a much grander prize. He saw a chance for a conquest on a scale that would rival Pompey's own triumphs in the East. Gaul was not a single enemy, but a mosaic of fierce tribes, vast forests, and unyielding mountains. Caesar's task was immense, demanding not just military might, but strategic brilliance and relentless endurance. And over the next 8 years, he proved he had all of it. Caesar's genius in Gaul was built on several key things. First was his incredible speed. His legions could march faster and further than anyone thought possible, constantly appearing where the enemy least expected them, catching them off guard before they could muster their full strength. Second was his mastery of Roman engineering. When Germanic tribes raided across the Rhine River, Caesar didn't just fight them back. He built a massive wooden bridge across the wide, fast-flowing river in just 10 days. It was an astonishing feat, a message to the tribes that Roman power could go anywhere. When he launched 2 expeditions to the mysterious island of Britain, he was doing something no Roman commander had ever done before. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, was his personal leadership. Caesar wasn't a general who commanded from a comfortable tent in the rear. He rode at the front. He shared the same food and the same hardships as his men. He knew his centurions by name. In one desperate battle, when his lines were about to break, he grabbed a shield from a soldier and personally plunged into the front rank to rally his troops. This created a bond between Caesar and his legions that was unbreakable. They weren't fighting for the Senate or the people of Rome. They were fighting for him. His greatest test came near the end of his campaigns, at the siege of Alesia. A charismatic Gallic chieftain named Vercingetorix had finally managed to unite many of the tribes against the Romans. He gathered a huge army in the fortress of Alesia. Caesar surrounded the fortress with an 11-mile wall of his own. But then, an even larger Gallic relief army arrived, trapping Caesar's army between the fortress and the new arrivals. In a moment of supreme brilliance, Caesar ordered his men to build a second wall, facing outwards. His legions fought a desperate battle on two fronts at once, and against all odds, they won. It was his masterpiece. Through a combination of lightning-fast maneuvers, brilliant engineering, and an unshakable bond with his legions, Caesar systematically dismantled Gallic resistance, carving out a legendary reputation with every victory. Back in Rome, these victories were the talk of the city. Caesar was careful to send back regular reports of his campaigns, what we now know as his commentaries on the Gallic War. They were brilliantly written, presented as factual accounts, but they were also masterpieces of political propaganda, designed to make him a hero in the eyes of the Roman people. And it worked. His name was on everyone's lips, but his triumphs also fueled deep unease. In the Senate, his political enemies watched his power grow with alarm. And even his ally Pompey, now watching from Rome, began to feel a shift. The balance of power within their secret pact was changing. Caesar was no longer the junior partner. His fame, his wealth from plunder, and his battle-hardened army now rivaled Pompey's own. His meteoric rise, fueled by legions loyal only to him, began to cast a long shadow over the delicate balance of power, creating palpable tension with his triumvirate partners. As Caesar's star reached its zenith in Gaul, the fragile bonds of the triumvirate began to fray. The death of a key member, and the growing rivalry between its two most powerful survivors, would soon ignite the sparks of an irreversible conflict. How would fate conspire to tear apart the uneasy alliance of Caesar and Pompey? Pacts born of convenience often dissolve under the weight of shifting ambitions. The first triumvirate, the powerful alliance that had dominated Roman politics, was a fragile construct. As the years passed, internal tensions mounted, and a tragic turn of events would remove a crucial counterbalance, leaving Caesar and Pompey on a collision course with destiny. While Caesar conquered distant lands, Rome itself was in turmoil. The city had become plagued by political violence, with gangs loyal to different politicians fighting pitched battles in the streets. The most notorious of these were led by a populist named Clodius and a more conservative figure named Milo. Their clashes paralyzed the government and made a mockery of law and order. Pompey, who was supposed to be maintaining stability in Rome, struggled to control the chaos. This chaos, combined with the news of Caesar's ever-growing power in Gaul, made the Senate deeply nervous. They started to see Caesar not as a Roman hero, but as a potential dictator, and in their fear, they began to pull at the fabric of the triumvirate, straining the relationship between its two remaining titans. But the first thread to snap was not political, it was personal. The most important human link between Caesar and Pompey was Caesar's daughter, Julia. Her marriage to Pompey had sealed their initial alliance, but by all accounts, it had become a genuinely affectionate relationship. She was the bond that turned a political arrangement into a family one. Then, in the year 54 BCE, tragedy struck. Julia died in childbirth, and the baby died with her. With her death, the subtle yet powerful Threads of loyalty holding Caesar and Pompey together were severed. Their bond, already under strain, now lacked its most vital emotional anchor. The second and final blow to the triumvirate came from the east. Crassus, the third member, had always been envious of the military glory his partners enjoyed. He was the money man, but he desperately wanted a military triumph of his own to put him on equal footing with Pompey and the now legendary Caesar. Driven by this desire, he secured for himself a command in the east and launched a massive, ill-fated invasion of the powerful Parthian Empire. In 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae, his ambition met a disastrous end. The Roman army was annihilated by the skilled Parthian horse archers, and Crassus himself was captured and killed. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, but its political consequences were even greater. It dissolved the triumvirate entirely, leaving the two remaining giants to face each other without a mediating force. The fragile alliance was no more. The death of Crassus removed the final bridge between Caesar and Pompey, leaving them standing on opposing sides of a rapidly widening chasm. With the chaos in Rome continuing, the Senate turned to Pompey. They saw him as their champion, the one man powerful enough to stand against the approaching threat of Caesar. Pompey, for his part, accepted this new role. He grew more distant from his old ally, more suspicious of his motives. He was now the defender of the Republic, at least in his own eyes. And from his camp in Gaul, Caesar saw this shift clearly. He was becoming isolated, and his enemies in the Senate were circling, waiting for his command to expire so they could prosecute him and strip him of his power. His personal ambitions were now a direct threat to Pompey, and Pompey's were a threat to him. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation. As political maneuvering turned into open hostility, the demands placed on Caesar by the Senate became increasingly untenable. The fateful moment of decision was drawing near, a line in the sand that would plunge the Roman Republic into an unimaginable civil war. What was this fateful line, and how would Caesar make the irrevocable choice that would change Rome forever? The air in Rome grew thick with political intrigue, a silent, deadly game played between titans. As Caesar's power swelled, the Senate, emboldened by Pompey, began to tighten the net around him, pushing him towards an impossible choice. The fate of the Republic now hung on a single, fateful river crossing, a decision that would forever change the course of history. The demands from the Senate became an ultimatum. Caesar's command in Gaul was officially over. He was ordered to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. To you, that might sound reasonable, but for Caesar, it was a death sentence. The moment he laid down his command and lost the legal immunity that came with it, his enemies in the Senate, led by figures like Cato the Younger, would immediately bring him up on charges of corruption and illegal warfare. They would destroy him politically and financially, ending his career in disgrace. He had offered compromises to give up most of his army, to stand for consul while still in his province, but the Senate, urged on by Pompey, refused everything. It was a direct challenge, designed to cut him down, but it left him with an impossible choice: surrender and face ruin, or defy Rome itself. As a final act, two tribunes loyal to Caesar, Mark Antony and another, tried to veto the Senate's decree, but they were threatened with violence and forced to flee the city for their lives, disguised as slaves. Their arrival in Caesar's camp gave him the final justification he needed. He could now claim he was not attacking the Republic, but defending the sacred rights of its officials. And so, in January of 49 BCE, he stood with a single legion on the northern bank of a small river called the Rubicon. This tiny stream marked the official boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and the homeland of Italy. Under Roman law, it was forbidden for any general to lead an army out of his province and into Italy proper. To do so was an act of treason, an automatic declaration of war against the state. On the banks of the Rubicon, Caesar paused. He reportedly spoke with his commanders, weighing the monumental consequences of his next step. This tiny river marked the boundary between legality and rebellion. For hours, he agonized. To obey meant the end of everything he had worked for. To cross meant plunging the world into a war between Romans. Finally, according to the ancient historians, he made his decision, uttering the famous words, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. With that, he gave the order, and the 13th Legion marched across the bridge. The point of no return had been passed. The news of his crossing spread like wildfire, reaching Rome much faster than anyone had anticipated. Panic gripped the city. Pompey and the senators had completely misjudged Caesar. They thought he would negotiate, that he wouldn't dare commit such a brazen act of treason. They were unprepared. Pompey had boasted that he only needed to stamp his foot in Italy to raise legions, but now, faced with Caesar's terrifying speed, he realized he had no army ready to fight. Chaos erupted. Senators, terrified of Caesar's reputation for ruthlessness, packed their belongings and fled the city. Pompey, realizing he could not defend Rome, made the decision to abandon Italy altogether. With a single, audacious step, Caesar unleashed the dogs of war. Rome plunged into chaos, its leaders scrambling, as the relentless general marched directly on the eternal city, signaling the dawn of an unprecedented conflict. The Rubicon was crossed, and the Roman Republic descended into civil war. Caesar's lightning-fast advance would force Pompey into a desperate strategy, and the clash between old allies would soon unfold, not in Italy, but across the vast seas. Where would the forces of destiny first collide, and what desperate measures would Pompey take to rally his strength? With the Rubicon crossed, Caesar's offensive was a lightning bolt, catching his opponents completely off guard. This wasn't a slow, ponderous war. It was a race for control of Italy, a contest of speed and nerve that would force one of Rome's greatest generals to abandon the very heart of the Republic. Caesar's legions swept through Italy with astonishing speed, a whirlwind of calculated aggression. He didn't march like a brutal conqueror, but like a liberator. He showed surprising mercy, or clementia, as he called it. When he captured towns, he didn't sack them. When enemy soldiers surrendered, he often pardoned them and offered them a place in his own army. This was a brilliant psychological move. It calmed the fears of the Italian people and made surrender a much more attractive option for Pompey's isolated garrisons. City after city opened its gates to him. The heart of the Republic lay open before him, surprisingly undefended. His advance was so fast that Pompey and the senators barely had time to react. Faced with Caesar's unstoppable advance, Pompey made a difficult but strategically sound decision. He knew he couldn't fight Caesar in Italy on these terms. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. So, with a heavy heart, he enacted a daring strategy: abandon Italy, cross the Adriatic Sea to Greece, and tap into the immense resources and loyalties he had cultivated in the East. This was Pompey's turf. He was the great hero there. Kings and rulers owed him their thrones. He had access to vast wealth, endless supplies of food, and most importantly, a massive pool of potential soldiers. His plan was to use his powerful navy to control the seas, trapping Caesar in Italy. He would then build a colossal army, train it, and when the time was right, return to crush Caesar with overwhelming force. It was a good plan, the plan of a patient, experienced general. Caesar chased him all the way to the port of Brundisium, on the southern heel of Italy. But Pompey's navy controlled the harbor, and he managed to evacuate his forces, including most of the senators. Just as Caesar's army arrived, Caesar was now the master of Italy, but his enemy had escaped. He entered Rome, not as a conqueror, but as its new ruler. He helped himself to the state treasury to fund his war effort. But he knew the job was only half done. Pompey was in the east, building his great army. But Pompey also had 7 experienced, loyal legions stationed in Spain, in Caesar's rear. With Rome under his control, Caesar wasted no time. He knew he couldn't leave Pompey's veteran legions in Spain at his back. In a typically bold and rapid move, he turned his army west, not east. He marched to Spain, and in a brilliant campaign of maneuver that lasted just 49 days, he surrounded and forced the surrender of Pompey's entire army there without a single major battle. His famous quote from this campaign was, "I went to fight an army without a general, and returned to fight a general without an army." His swift campaign there was a calculated move to secure his position before the inevitable clash of titans in the east. Italy secured and Spain pacified, Caesar now turned his gaze eastward, across the treacherous Adriatic, where Pompey was amassing a force that dwarfed his own. The stage was set for the true test of their generalship. How would Caesar, with his smaller, veteran army, dare to challenge Pompey's powerful navy and colossal might in his own chosen theater of war? With Pompey firmly entrenched across the Adriatic, building an immense army and controlling the seas, Caesar faced an almost impossible challenge: how to get his legions to Greece. It was a desperate gamble, a perilous crossing that would test the very limits of his audacious genius and the loyalty of his men. The Adriatic was Pompey's fortress. His navy, commanded by a man named Bibulus, who personally hated Caesar, was formidable. It patrolled the waters constantly, a wall of warships meant to keep Caesar trapped in Italy. Pompey's plan was simple and effective. He would use his naval dominance to blockade the coast, slowly starving Caesar of supplies and support, while he continued to build his own unstoppable army in the east. It was designed to deny Caesar access to the crucial eastern battleground. But Caesar was not a man who played by conventional rules. Defying all logic, he decided to make his move in the dead of winter. The seas were rougher, the weather was treacherous, and he knew Pompey's fleet would be less vigilant. He didn't have enough transport ships to take his whole army at once, but that didn't stop him. He crammed as many soldiers as he could, 7 legions, so the ships he had, and set sail under the cover of darkness. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. Miraculously, he slipped through the blockade and landed his troops safely on the shores of Epirus in modern-day Albania. But now, with only half his legions, he was dangerously exposed. Staring across the sea at the rest of his army, led by his trusted lieutenant Mark Antony, still trapped in Italy, days turned into weeks of desperate waiting. Caesar's position was incredibly dangerous. He had a small force, deep in enemy territory, with Pompey's much larger army not far away. Every day that passed without his reinforcements was a day closer to disaster. Pompey's fleet, furious that they had let Caesar slip through, now tightened their blockade, making a second crossing seem impossible. Caesar grew so desperate that at one point he disguised himself as a slave and tried to row a small boat back to Italy himself, only to be turned back by a violent storm. The fate of his entire campaign hung by a thread. Finally, Mark Antony, seeing a window of opportunity, gathered the remaining troops, boarded the transports, and made his own daring dash across the sea. After a tense chase, he managed to evade Pompey's ships and land his forces, reuniting with Caesar. The relief must have been immense. His army was whole again, and his hope was rekindled, with his forces finally united on Greek soil. Caesar now faced the daunting task of confronting Pompey's meticulously prepared and vastly superior army. The stage was set for a prolonged, tense struggle in the heart of Greece. How would Caesar, always the innovator, overcome the immense numerical disadvantage against Rome's greatest living general? Our next chapter takes us to the siege of Dyrrhachium. Having defied the odds and landed his whole army in Greece, Caesar now faced Pompey's colossal force, perfectly supplied by sea and dug in around the strategic port of Dyrrhachium. This was not going to be a quick, decisive fight. It was a grueling war of maneuver, a tactical chess match that would test the patience of both commanders and give Caesar a rare taste of defeat. Pompey was in an almost impregnable position. His army was significantly larger than Caesar's. His camp was on high ground, well fortified, and most importantly, it was right next to the sea. His navy could bring him endless supplies of food, equipment, and reinforcements. He had no need to risk a battle. Pompey, cautious and calculating, decided to play the long game. His strategy was to simply wait, to engage in small skirmishes, and let Caesar's smaller army slowly starve. Denied access to food from the countryside, and unable to be resupplied by sea, Caesar's veteran legions would wither on the vine. It was a smart, patient strategy. But Caesar was never patient. Faced with this dilemma, he decided on a course of action so audacious, so bold, it bordered on madness. If he couldn't attack Pompey's camp directly, he would besiege it. He ordered his smaller army to begin constructing a massive line of walls and forza, circumvallation that would stretch for over 15 miles, completely encircling Pompey's much larger army. It was an incredible feat of military engineering. His goal was to cut Pompey off from foraging on land, to restrict his access to fresh water, and to damage his prestige by showing the world that Pompey the Great was being penned in by a smaller force. In a move that defied all military logic, Caesar was trying to trap a larger army, hoping to provoke a mistake. For months, the two armies stared at each other from behind their earthworks. It was a tense war of attrition, with constant small-scale fighting along the siege lines. But Pompey's strategy was working. Caesar's men were on the brink of starvation, forced to eat a type of bread made from a bitter root, while Pompey's soldiers were well-fed and comfortable. The situation was becoming desperate for Caesar. Finally, Pompey saw his opportunity. Aided by deserters from Caesar's camp, he planned a perfectly coordinated attack, using his ships to land troops behind Caesar's lines while simultaneously launching a frontal assault. His forces broke through a weak point in the wall. Panic erupted in Caesar's ranks. His veteran legions, for the first time in years, broke and fled. It was a rout. Caesar himself tried to rally his men, but the momentum was unstoppable. He was forced to order a full retreat, having suffered a clear and humiliating defeat. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar suffered a rare, stinging defeat. His lines were breached, his legions pushed back, and for a fleeting moment, the tide of the civil war seemed to turn against him. It was a stark reminder that even he was not invincible. But Pompey, ever cautious, did not press his advantage and order a full-scale pursuit that might have destroyed Caesar's army. Seeing this, Caesar reportedly said, "Today the victory would have been the enemy's, had they had a commander who knew how to win." Dyrrhachium was a setback, but Caesar, ever resilient, was not broken. He understood his strategy had failed. He needed to change the game, to abandon the coast and march inland, to lure Pompey away from his supply lines and onto a battlefield of his own choosing. The great chess match would now move to the plains of Thessaly. Who would make the final fatal move that would determine the fate of the Republic? After the stalemate and setback at Dyrrhachium, Caesar, with dwindling supplies, made a strategic retreat inland, into the wide open plains of Thessaly. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the kind of ground he needed. A vast, open field where his tactical brilliance and the sheer discipline of his veteran legions could finally be unleashed against Pompey's superior numbers. The fate of the Roman Republic would be decided here, on this single, dusty plain. Pompey followed him. After his victory at Dyrrhachium, the senators and aristocrats in his camp were full of confidence. They urged him to finish Caesar off, mocking Pompey for his caution and calling him a king who was reluctant to give up his power. Pressured by his arrogant allies, Pompey abandoned his patient strategy and agreed to a decisive battle. On the plains, near a town called Pharsalus, the two Roman worlds collided. Pompey's army was enormous, numbering perhaps 45,000 infantry, more than double Caesar's 22,000. His cavalry advantage was even greater, with 7,000 horsemen against Caesar's mere 1,000. Pompey and the senators with him believed these numbers would guarantee victory. Caesar, looking across the field at the massive host arrayed against him, trusted in the unbreakable loyalty of his veterans and in his own tactical genius. The battle plan for Pompey was simple and powerful. He would use his overwhelming cavalry on his left flank to crush Caesar's small force of horsemen. Once they were swept from the field, his cavalry would swing around and smash into the rear of Caesar's infantry, while his main line of legions advanced from the front. It was a classic hammer and anvil maneuver, and with his advantage in numbers, it should have been unstoppable. But Caesar, ever the innovator, anticipated this exact move. He saw the massive deployment of cavalry and knew what was coming. In a moment of sheer brilliance, he did something extraordinary. He quietly pulled one cohort, a few hundred men from each of his legions in the third line, forming a secret, hidden fourth line of his toughest veterans. He placed them behind his own cavalry, out of sight, and gave them very specific, brutal instructions. He told them not to throw their javelins, but to use them as stabbing spears, and to aim directly for the eyes and faces of the enemy horsemen. He laid a trap. The battle began, the trumpets blared, and as planned, Pompey's huge cavalry force charged forward. They easily overwhelmed Caesar's small group of horsemen, who fought briefly before falling back. The Pompeian cavalry, young, rich noblemen, surged forward, smelling victory. But just as they thought they had broken through, they crashed headlong into Caesar's hidden fourth line. The sight of these grim, battle-hardened legionaries standing firm, thrusting their sharp javelins upwards into their faces and their horses, created absolute panic. The charge faltered, the momentum was lost, and the elite cavalry broke and fled the field in a complete rout. Caesar's trap had worked perfectly, and his veterans in the fourth line didn't stop there. They wheeled around and slammed into the now undefended flank of Pompey's main infantry line. At that exact moment, Caesar ordered his main legions to advance. Pompey's infantry, who had been ordered to stand still and receive the charge, were now hit from the front and the side simultaneously. The line buckled, then shattered. Pharsalus was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation. From his command post, Pompey the Great watched his cavalry flee, saw his legions begin to collapse, and realized his entire strategy had failed. In a state of shock, he simply turned his horse, rode back to his camp, and then fled out the back, disguised as a commoner. The hopes of the senatorial faction, and the Republic as it was known, lay shattered on the dusty plains of Thessaly, its fate now firmly in Caesar's hands. The sun set on the Republic, forever changed by the clash at Pharsalus. Caesar stood victorious, but his rival, Pompey the Great, remained at large, a living symbol of resistance. The relentless pursuit would continue, leading to a tragic, ignominious end for one of Rome's greatest sons, and a new, perilous chapter for the victor. What cruel fate awaited Pompey, and how would Caesar react to his rival's ultimate demise? The plains of Pharsalus had been silenced, yet the civil war was not truly over as long as Pompey the Great, the champion of the Republic, remained alive. Fleeing the utter devastation of his army, he embarked on a desperate journey, a hunted figure whose very existence threatened Caesar's new order. His final, desperate hope lay in the ancient, wealthy land of Egypt. From the ashes of his defeat, Pompey became a fugitive, a shadow of his former glory. You have to imagine the state of his mind. This was a man who had been celebrated as Rome's greatest general for decades. He had been given unprecedented powers, celebrated magnificent triumphs, and was seen as the defender of the Republic. Now, he was running for his life, his grand army destroyed, his political allies scattered to the winds. He tried to rally what supporters he could find, sailing from port to port in the eastern Mediterranean. But the news of Pharsalus traveled faster than he did. Doors that were once open to him were now closed. Allies, who had once eagerly promised him support, now turned him away, afraid of angering the new master of the Roman world, Caesar. Egypt was technically an independent kingdom, ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was fabulously wealthy and had a significant military force. More importantly, Pompey had a personal connection there. He had been a patron and protector of the previous pharaoh, the father of the current rulers. He believed he would find a safe haven there, a place to regroup, and perhaps even rebuild his forces. He thought his past favors would be remembered and repaid. But the Egypt he was sailing towards was a snake pit of political intrigue. The throne was being viciously contested between the young boy king Ptolemy XIII and his brilliant and ambitious older sister, Cleopatra. The real power, however, if they helped Pompey, they would make an enemy of the victorious Caesar, who was surely not far behind. But if they turned Pompey away, they risked angering a man who, even in defeat, was still a legendary figure with powerful connections. In the halls of the royal palace in Alexandria, A cold, calculated debate took place. But, he argued, a dead man cannot bite. A dead Pompey would not be a threat to them, and presenting his head to Caesar would surely be a gift that would win the new ruler's favor. The advisors, weighing the risks, determined that only one course of action would guarantee their safety from Caesar: the elimination of his great rival. Pompey the Great, Rome's once unrivaled champion, sailed towards the Egyptian coast, completely unaware of the cruel fate that awaited him. As the famous lighthouse of Alexandria came into view, he saw a small boat being rowed out from the shore to meet his ship. He believed it was an honor guard, sent to escort him to the king. He prepared to disembark, leaving his wife and followers behind, stepping into the boat that would carry him to his tragic destiny. The journey had been long, desperate, and filled with the haunting echoes of lost glory. As Pompey's small boat approached the Egyptian shore, he likely envisioned a new beginning, a chance to rebuild. Instead, he would meet a fate more brutal and ignominious than any battlefield defeat, at the hands of those he least suspected. The air in the small boat was thick with an unsettling silence. Pompey sat straight, clutching a scroll on which he had written a speech in Greek to deliver to the young king. He recognized one of the men in the boat, a Roman named Lucius Septimius, who had once served as an officer in his own army years ago. He turned to him and said, "I believe I know you, my friend. You served with me once." Septimius just nodded grimly, offering no reply. The silence returned, heavier than before, as the boat touched the sandy shore of Pelusium. Pompey prepared to stand. He offered his hand to an attendant to help him up, and in that moment, as his attention was divided, Septimius drew his sword and stabbed him from behind. Immediately, the others in the boat drew their daggers and joined the attack. Pompey, seeing he was betrayed, did not cry out or fight back. With a final act of Roman dignity, he pulled his toga up over his head, covering his face so no one would see his expression in his final moments. He fell without a sound. The welcome was not one of refuge, but of chilling betrayal. The blade, wielded by a former Roman, ended the life of the man who had once stood as Rome's greatest general. A silent, brutal act of political expediency. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He came with a small force, unaware of what had transpired. He was the victor, but he was also entering a foreign kingdom, and he was cautious. He expected to have to negotiate with Pompey, perhaps offer him his famous clemency, and finally bring the civil war to a dignified end. Instead, he was met by the king's courtiers. With great ceremony, they presented him with a gift, something they were sure would please him and earn his favor. It was a severed head, still gruesome, preserved in a jar. It was the head of Pompey the Great. They also presented him with Pompey's signet ring. The severed head of Pompey, presented as a trophy, brought not triumph, but a profound, almost visceral shock to Caesar. He recoiled in horror. It was a victory denied, an ending deprived of his own terms, and a stark reminder of the brutality of power. The ancient historians say that Caesar turned his face away and wept. These were not tears of joy, but of genuine grief and rage. Pompey had been his rival, his enemy, but he had also been his former son-in-law, a fellow Roman, and one of the greatest figures the Republic had ever produced. To be murdered so treacherously by foreign schemers was an insult to Roman dignity, an insult to Pompey's legacy, and an insult to Caesar himself. He saw it as a barbaric act, unworthy of a Roman general. Though adversaries, Caesar harbored a deep, complex respect for Pompey. His reaction to the assassination was one of fury. He swiftly had the chief conspirator, Pothinus, executed. He rejected the entire premise of their gift. He took Pompey's head and ring, and later arranged for the remains to be given a proper Roman burial, granting his fallen rival the dignity in death that he had been so brutally denied. The tragic death of Pompey the Great marked the definitive end of the Roman civil war. Caesar now stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world, but his arrival in Egypt would soon entangle him in a new, captivating drama, one that would introduce him to a legendary queen and a new chapter of intrigue. What ancient allure awaited the victorious general in the land of the pharaohs? With Pompey gone, Caesar found himself not just in Egypt, but entangled in a fierce royal struggle. Here, in the ancient city of Alexandria, he would encounter a figure who would capture his imagination, his intellect, and perhaps even his heart: the formidable and captivating Queen Cleopatra VII. This encounter would become as legendary as any of his conquests. Egypt, a land of immense wealth and ancient power, was embroiled in a bitter sibling rivalry for its throne. By the terms of their father's will, the young King Ptolemy XIII was supposed to rule jointly with his older sister, Cleopatra. But Ptolemy's advisors, the same men who had murdered Pompey, had driven Cleopatra out of Alexandria and into exile. She was raising an army of her own in the desert, and Egypt was on the brink of a full-blown civil war. Caesar, as the representative of Rome and the most powerful man in the Mediterranean, decided he would mediate the dispute. He wasn't just doing it out of a sense of justice. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and a stable Egypt was vital for supplying grain to the people of Rome. He summoned both siblings to the palace to plead their cases before him. But Cleopatra had a problem. The palace was controlled by her enemies. She couldn't just walk in the front door. So, in a moment of breathtaking audacity that has become legendary, she devised a plan to bypass her brother's guards. The story goes that she had herself wrapped up inside a large carpet or a laundry sack. A loyal servant then carried this bundle into the palace, past the guards, claiming it was a gift for Caesar. He carried it directly into Caesar's private quarters and unrolled it, revealing the young queen inside. It was a brilliant, theatrical entrance, and it gave her exactly what she wanted: a private audience with Caesar. She wasn't just a beautiful woman. She was intelligent, witty, spoke multiple languages, and possessed a charisma that was reportedly irresistible. She captivated the pragmatic Roman general, and that night they forged an alliance that was both political and deeply personal. When young King Ptolemy discovered the next morning that his sister was not only in the palace but had already won Caesar over, he flew into a rage. His advisors stirred up the people of Alexandria against the Romans, and the city erupted into violence. The small force Caesar had with him was suddenly besieged inside the royal palace, cut off and surrounded by the much larger Egyptian army. What followed was a brutal, desperate conflict known as the Alexandrian War. For months, Caesar and his men fought for their lives in the streets and harbor of the great city. During the fighting, a fire broke out that tragically spread to and destroyed part of the great library of Alexandria, an immeasurable loss to the ancient world. But eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. In a final battle near the Nile, the Egyptian army was crushed, and the young King Ptolemy drowned in the river while trying to escape. Caesar had won. He placed Cleopatra firmly on the throne of Egypt, and before he left, she was pregnant with his child, a son they would name Caesar. With Cleopatra now firmly on the Egyptian throne and a son bearing his name, Caesar had momentarily found respite and a unique alliance. But the Roman Republic, though subdued, still held pockets of resistance, and a true return to Rome awaited the final consolidation of his power. What further battles lay ahead for the conqueror, and how would he attempt to govern the vast empire he now controlled? While Caesar was captivated by the luxury and intrigue of Egypt, the embers of the civil war still smoldered across the vast Roman world. The fight was not over. Remaining Pompeian loyalists, led by formidable figures, continued to defy his authority, forcing the weary general to once again take up his sword and crush the last vestiges of resistance. The path to undisputed power would demand one final grueling march. His first stop was North Africa. Here, the remnants of the Republican cause had gathered a powerful army. They were led by Metellus Scipio, Pompey's former father-in-law, and King Juba, a local African monarch, allied with them. But their spiritual leader was a man Caesar both respected and feared, Cato the Younger. Cato was a stoic philosopher and an unbending republican. He saw Caesar as a tyrant who was destroying the very soul of Rome. He would never compromise, never surrender. In the scorching deserts of Africa, Caesar faced this resilient enemy. The campaign was difficult, but in 46 BCE, at the Battle of Thapsus, Caesar's tactical genius once again proved decisive. He crushed the Republican army, but Cato was not captured. He had retreated to the nearby city of Utica. Realizing all was lost, and refusing to live in a world ruled by Caesar, Cato committed suicide in a calm, deliberate act of political defiance. He became an instant martyr for the lost Republican cause, a powerful symbol against Caesar's burgeoning autocracy. With his enemies in Africa scattered, Caesar returned to Rome, not just as a victor, but as a reformer. He celebrated 4 magnificent triumphs for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa pointedly, not for defeating fellow Romans. He then embarked on an ambitious program to try and mend the broken state. He tackled Rome's deep-seated problems, offering debt relief, distributing grain to the poor, and starting massive public works projects to create jobs. Most famously, he reformed the chaotic Roman calendar, creating the new Julian calendar, a system so accurate that with minor adjustments, it's the same one most of the world still uses today. But the war was not quite over. The final gasp of resistance came from distant Spain. Pompey's 2 sons, Gnaeus and Sextus Pompey, had raised a new army there, fueled by vengeance and desperation. Caesar had to march once more. In 45 BCE, at the Battle of Munda, he faced his final test. This was no easy victory. The fighting was so brutal, so desperate, that for a moment Caesar's lines began to break. It is said that Caesar himself, seeing his veterans falter, ran to the front line, sword in hand, and fought like a common soldier, shouting that if they retreated, they could tell everyone they had abandoned their general. His personal courage rallied his men, and they pushed forward to a final, bloody victory. Munda was a brutal, hard-fought battle, a stark reminder of the terrible cost of this long war. But it was the definitive end to the great Roman Civil War. With all military opposition finally crushed, Caesar stood as the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. The Republic, though still technically existing, lay prostrate at his feet. His unparalleled power would soon lead to a series of honors and titles that stretched the very fabric of Roman tradition. But how would Rome, a city that had thrown out its kings centuries before, react to a citizen who now held more power than any king had ever dreamed of. The civil wars were over, but the future of Rome was more uncertain than ever. Caesar, the ultimate victor, began to gather up powers and honors that were unprecedented in the history of the Republic, effectively transforming himself from a general into an absolute ruler. His every move, his every decree, now held the weight of destiny, creating both admiration from the masses and deep, seething resentment from the elite. Caesar's power grew exponentially, piled on him by a Senate that was now either terrified of him or filled with his own supporters. He was made dictator, at first for a term of 10 years, and then, most shockingly, he was named dictator perpetuo dictator for life. This was something Rome had never seen. The office of dictator was supposed to be a temporary, emergency power. Making it permanent broke every tradition. He held the consulship year after year. As Pontifex Maximus, he was the head of the state religion. He was granted the power of a tribune for life, which meant his body was legally sacred and untouchable. He controlled who was elected to office. He proposed all major laws, and his face began to appear on Roman coins, something previously reserved for gods or long-dead ancestors. He held all the reins of power in his own hands. The Republic, though its old name and offices still existed, now bowed to the will of one man, a transformation many found deeply unsettling. And yet his rule brought a new kind of order and efficiency. Caesar's reforms were sweeping, aimed at healing the wounds of the Civil War and building a more stable, more modern state. He continued his massive public works programs, creating jobs and beautifying the city. He settled thousands of his veterans and many of Rome's urban poor on new land in the provinces. He expanded Roman citizenship to people in Italy and even in some of the provinces, making the empire feel more unified. He was not just a power-hungry tyrant, he was a visionary administrator, attempting to solve the very problems that had caused the Republic to crumble in the first place. But all these changes were implemented by a single, unchallengeable will. For the traditional Roman aristocracy, this was the ultimate horror. Their fear grew with every new honor Caesar accepted. They saw him adopting the symbols of monarchy. He wore a special purple toga, the color of kings. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate house that looked very much like a throne. Statues of him were put up alongside the statues of Rome's ancient kings. The final straw for many came during a public festival, when his loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, tried to place a royal crown on his head. Caesar refused it, and the crowd cheered. But for many senators watching, the message was clear. It was a test, a public relations stunt, to see if the people were ready to accept him as king. For many Romans, the very idea of a single, absolute ruler was an insult to their deepest values, a chilling echo of the tyranny their ancestors had fought to overthrow centuries earlier. Caesar sat atop a mountain of unprecedented power, admired by many, but feared by a desperate few who clung to the fading ideals of the Republic. The whispers of conspiracy began to circulate in the shadowy corners of the Senate, quiet at first, then growing in fervor. The stage was being set not for another battle, but for a shocking betrayal that would forever change the course of Roman history. What terrible plot was brewing in the heart of Rome, and who would dare to strike down the invincible dictator? Even amidst grand reforms and undisputed power, the seeds of dissent often find fertile ground in the shadows. As Caesar concentrated all authority into his own hands, a desperate fear began to grip a faction of the Roman elite. The fear that the Republic, so fiercely defended for centuries, was dying. Whispers of treason would soon coalesce into a deadly plot aimed at preserving Rome's ancient liberty, no matter the cost. For a Roman, the word king was poison. For almost 500 years, ever since their ancestors had expelled the tyrant Tarquin the Proud, the very idea of one-man rule was anathema. It was the foundation of their identity. And now every symbolic gesture, every honor bestowed upon Caesar, became a stark reminder to some that he was slowly, inexorably, becoming the very thing Rome had sworn to cast out. His permanent dictatorship, his purple robes, the golden chair in the Senate, each one was another nail in the coffin of the Republic. The specter of monarchy loomed, chilling those who cherished the Republic's freedom. And so a conspiracy began to form. It drew in over 60 senators, a mix of men with different motives. Some were old enemies of Caesar, former Pompeians, whom he had pardoned, but who never forgave him. Others were driven by pure republican idealism, and some, perhaps, were simply jealous of his immense power. The two main leaders were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was a sharp, practical man, a skilled general in his own right, who had a deep-seated hatred of tyranny in any form. He was the engine of the conspiracy, the organizer. But the heart of the plot was Brutus. This was the man everyone looked to for moral legitimacy. He was a direct descendant of the legendary Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had expelled the last king of Rome. His family name was synonymous with republican liberty. Caesar genuinely liked and respected Brutus, promoting him and showing him great favor. This made Brutus's decision an agonizing one. He was torn between his personal affection for Caesar and what he saw as his sacred duty to his country. In the end, his family legacy and the arguments of Cassius won out. And to make the betrayal even more profound, the plot included men from Caesar's innermost circle, like Decimus Brutus, one of his most trusted generals, a man he considered almost like a son. The conspirators were not merely political enemies. They were men from Caesar's own circle, generals, friends, even those he had pardoned. Their reasons were complex, a tangled web of republican ideals, personal ambitions, and a desperate, perhaps naive, hope for a return to the old ways. As the Ides of March 15th approached, the whispers hardened into a concrete plan. They had to act fast. Caesar was about to leave for a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire, the same empire that had killed Crassus. If he left, he might be gone for years, and would likely return, even more powerful and beloved than before. It was now or never. They decided to strike during a meeting of the Senate. The location they chose was heavy with irony. The Senate would be meeting in a hall attached to the theater of Pompey, and the attack would take place at the foot of a great statue of Caesar's vanquished rival. The stage was set for a shocking act that would send ripples through eternity. The plot was meticulously laid, the conspirators resolute. Caesar, however, was dismissive of warnings, perhaps too confident in his destiny, or simply too weary to suspect such deep betrayal from men he had shown such kindness. As the fateful day dawned, the city of Rome, seemingly at peace, held its breath, unaware of the bloody drama about to unfold within its most sacred halls. The morning of the Ides of March, 44 BCE, dawned like any other, yet it would forever be etched in history as the day a giant fell. Caesar, warned by omens and prophets, proceeded to the Senate. surrounded by trusted friends and hidden enemies. The heart of Rome was about to witness a shocking act of political violence that would plunge the Republic into chaos. Despite the portents and warnings, Caesar, driven by an unyielding spirit or perhaps a fatalistic confidence, walked towards his destiny. He had been told by a soothsayer named Spurina to beware the Ides of March. Seeing the man in the crowd on his way to the Senate, Caesar reportedly joked, "The Ides of March have come." The soothsayer replied grimly, "Aye, Caesar, but not yet gone." Another man, a Greek scholar named Artemidorus, tried to hand him a scroll that detailed the entire conspiracy, begging him to read it immediately. But in the crush of the crowd, with so many people trying to give him petitions, Caesar simply passed the scroll to an attendant, unable to read the warning that could have saved his life. Unseen, the conspirators moved into their positions inside the meeting hall, their hearts pounding with a desperate resolve. As Caesar entered the chamber and took his seat on his golden chair, the plot began. One of the conspirators, Trebonius, cleverly drew Caesar's loyal and powerful co-consul, Mark Antony, outside for a supposedly urgent conversation, leaving Caesar completely unprotected among the senators. Then the signal. A senator named Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition, pleading for the return of his exiled brother. As he spoke, he grabbed Caesar's purple toga with both hands and pulled it down from his neck. It was an act of aggression, and it was the sign for the others to attack. Another conspirator, Casca, struck the first blow from behind, aiming for the neck, but managing only a glancing wound. Caesar, startled, spun around. He was a fighter. He cried out and stabbed Casca in the arm with his stylus, the sharp metal pen he used for writing. He tried to lunge away, but now the others swarmed him. The chamber erupted in chaos. With a sudden, terrifying swiftness, the senators rushed forward, their daggers flashing in the light. They stabbed him from all sides, a frenzy of blades. He fought back, twisting and turning, but he was surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered. And then, through the crowd of his attackers, he saw a face he knew. He saw Marcus Brutus, the man he had pardoned, the man he had promoted, the man he had treated like a son, lunging forward with his own dagger drawn. In that moment, all the fight went out of him. The ancient historians say he stopped resisting, pulled his toga back up over his face, and uttered his final words, a heartbroken whisper of disbelief, "Et Brute, you too, Brutus." He fell at the foot of the statue of his great rival, Pompey, his blood pooling on the marble floor from 23 stab wounds. Silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the gasps of the few brave enough to remain. The other senators had fled in panic. Brutus raised his bloody dagger, trying to make a speech, to proclaim that they had killed a tyrant and restored liberty to Rome. But no one was listening. The conspirators, believing they had restored the Republic, had instead opened a Pandora's box, unleashing new, unforeseen horrors. For a few moments, the body of the most powerful man in the world lay alone and abandoned. Caesar lay dead, his blood staining the floor of the Senate. But the Republic was not saved. It was thrust into an even deeper abyss of civil strife. The assassins had killed the dictator, but they had not killed the idea of absolute power. Nor had they accounted for the loyalty of Caesar's vast following. What immediate chaos would engulf Rome, and who would rise to claim the mantle of the fallen Titan? The assassination of Caesar, intended to restore liberty, instead shattered the fragile peace of Rome, plunging the Republic into a terrifying void. The conspirators, hailed by some as liberators, were reviled by many as murderers. And from the ashes of Caesar's funeral pyre, new, formidable contenders would rise, eager to claim his legacy and avenge his death. The civil wars were far from over. The assassins had struck the blow, but they had failed to grasp the depth of Caesar's popular support, or the sheer number of his loyal veterans scattered across the empire. They had a plan to kill the man, but no concrete plan for what to do next. They made speeches from the Capitoline Hill, proclaiming the restoration of liberty, but they found the public response to be cold, fearful, and confused. They had failed to understand that most ordinary Romans were simply weary of endless civil strife, and that Caesar, for all his faults, had brought stability and order. Their act of liberation was seen by many as a monstrous sacrilege. From the funeral pyre of Caesar, a new power emerged. Mark Antony, as Caesar's co-consul and most trusted lieutenant. Antony at first seemed cautious, negotiating a tense truce with the conspirators, but he was a brilliant political operator. At Caesar's public funeral, he seized his moment. He delivered a masterful eulogy, reading from Caesar's will, which revealed that Caesar had left a sum of money to every single citizen of Rome. He then held up Caesar's bloody, torn toga for the crowd to see, pointing out the stab wounds. The crowd, already emotional, was whipped into a frenzy of grief and rage. Riots broke out across the city. The people hunted for the assassins, who were forced to flee Rome for their lives. With this single, fiery speech, Antony turned public sentiment decisively against them and established himself as Caesar's natural successor. But from the shadows emerged an unexpected heir. Caesar's will not only left money to the people, it contained a political bombshell. It revealed that he had officially adopted his teenage grandnephew, a young man named Gaius Octavius, and made him the heir to his name and 3/4 of his immense fortune. This young man, who was studying abroad when he heard the news, was dismissed by many, including Antony, as a mere boy, a political lightweight, but they underestimated him. He immediately sailed for Italy, took the name Gaius Julius Caesar, Octavianus or Octavian, as we call him, and began to gather support. Armed with the magic of Caesar's name and a shrewd, cold understanding of power, he appealed directly to Caesar's veterans, who saw him as the true heir. He quickly proved himself to be a political prodigy, destined to challenge even the mighty Mark Antony for supremacy. The void left by Caesar's death quickly filled with rival ambitions. The stage was now set for the second triumvirate, a new, brutal chapter of civil war, as Octavian, Antony, and a third general named Lepidus sought to avenge Caesar and solidify their own power. The Roman world, instead of finding peace, would once again be consumed by the flames of conflict. The chaos, after Caesar's death, escalated into a new, more terrifying phase of civil war. Unlikely allies, Octavian and Mark Antony, along with the less influential General Lepidus, would set aside their animosities to form a new, official alliance. The second triumvirate, their shared goal, to avenge Caesar's murder and solidify their grip on Rome through brutal force and the systematic elimination of their enemies. This was not like the first triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, which had been a secret, informal pact. This new triumvirate was a formal, legal institution, a 5-year dictatorship established by law. The irony was bitter. Their stated goal was to restore the Republic, but they planned to do it by holding absolute power and destroying anyone who stood in their way. Where the first triumvirate was a secret pact, this was a legally sanctioned dictatorship. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus united, not just to rule, but to avenge. And their first act would send shivers down the spine of Rome, to fund their coming war against Brutus and Cassius, and to eliminate any potential opposition at home. The triumvirs unleashed a reign of terror known as the proscriptions. They posted lists in the public forum, lists of condemned men. Anyone on the list was declared an enemy of the state. Their property was confiscated, and a bounty was placed on their head. It was an open invitation for citizens to murder their neighbors. Sons betrayed fathers, slaves betrayed masters. No one was safe. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy citizens were hunted down and killed. The most famous victim was the great orator Cicero. He had been a champion of the Republic and had fiercely spoken out against Mark Antony. For that, he was proscribed. He was caught trying to escape, and his head and hands were cut off and nailed to the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. A chilling message to anyone who dared to speak out against the new regime. With their enemies in Rome dead or in hiding, and their treasury full of confiscated wealth, the triumvirs turned their attention east. Brutus and Cassius had fled Rome and had managed to raise a large army in Macedonia, the last great hope of the Republican cause. In the year 42 BCE, the two sides finally met on the plains of Philippi, the same region where Caesar had defeated Pompey. In a final bloody act of vengeance, the armies clashed. The battle was fought in two stages. In the first engagement, Brutus's forces actually defeated Octavian's, but Antony managed to overwhelm Cassius's camp. Cassius, mistakenly believing that Brutus had also been defeated, took his own life. A few weeks later, the final battle was fought. This time, Antony and Octavian were completely victorious. Brutus, seeing that all was lost, also committed suicide, running on his own sword. With their desperate deaths, the last embers of Republican resistance were extinguished. Caesar's murder was avenged, but at a terrible cost to the soul of Rome. With their enemies vanquished and their power absolute, the triumvirs now divided the Roman world amongst themselves. Antony took the wealthy, glamorous east. Octavian took the difficult, but strategically vital, west, including Italy. And the third member, Lepidus, was given the lesser prize of Africa, the ultimate heir to Caesar's legacy, and the true future of Rome remained to be decided. With all enemies vanquished, the Roman world, weary from decades of civil war, yearned for peace. But that peace could not last while two such mighty figures, Octavian and Mark Antony, shared the reins of power. The alliance forged in blood would inevitably break, leading to a final/monumental clash that would determine not just the fate of two men, but the destiny of Rome itself. The uneasy alliance cracked under the weight of ambition and distrust. Mark Antony, ruling from the east, became famously entangled with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. He lived with her in Alexandria, adopting many of the luxurious customs of an Eastern monarch. He began giving away Roman territories to her and their children, as if they were his personal property. Back in Rome, the young, calculating Octavian saw his chance. He began a brilliant propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman heritage, a weakling corrupted by a foreign queen, a traitor to the values of the Republic. He even managed to get hold of Antony's will and read it to the Senate, revealing Antony's wishes to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. public opinion turned decisively against him. The final confrontation came in the year 31 BCE, in a massive naval battle off the coast of Greece, near a place called Actium. The fate of the Roman world was sealed on the waves. The two colossal fleets clashed in a struggle for supremacy. But then, something strange happened. For reasons historians still debate, Cleopatra's squadron of ships suddenly broke from the line of battle and sailed away. Mark Antony, seeing her flee, abandoned his own flagship, boarded a smaller, faster ship, and followed her, leaving his massive fleet and his loyal army leaderless and confused. The battle turned into a rout. Antony's forces, demoralized by their general's flight, surrendered. Octavian was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. The sun set on the legendary lovers in Egypt. Octavian pursued them, and as his legions closed in on Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra, their dreams shattered, chose to end their own lives. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, after a final, defiant meeting with Octavian, famously allowed herself to be bitten by a venomous snake, perhaps an asp, hidden in a basket of figs. They chose death over the humiliation of being paraded in Octavian's triumph. With their deaths, Octavian stood alone, the undisputed master of Rome, ready to reshape its destiny. He returned to Rome, the last man standing, after decades of brutal civil war. But he was far more cunning than his great-uncle, Caesar. He had learned from Caesar's mistakes. He knew that the Romans would never accept a king or a dictator for life. So, he performed a political masterpiece. He went before the Senate and announced that he was restoring the Republic. He claimed he was giving all his power back to the Senate and the Roman people, but it was a carefully crafted illusion. While the old offices and traditions of the Republic continued, he kept for himself the key powers, control of the most important provinces, and with them, control of the vast majority of the army. The Senate, grateful for the peace he had brought, showered him with honors and a new name, Augustus, the revered one. He was never called king. He called himself Princeps' first citizen. But make no mistake, the Republic was gone. The Roman Empire had begun. And so, the grand, tragic rivalry of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great comes to its close. Caesar, the brilliant, ambitious challenger, whose genius laid the groundwork for the empire, but who never lived to rule it. His name would become a title Kaiser, Sarah, synonym for absolute power for centuries to come. And Pompey, the great champion of the Republic, the establishment man who was ultimately outmaneuvered by a new kind of politics and a new kind of ambition. His life represents the Republic's final, desperate struggle against the inevitable tide of change. Their clash, born of ambition and circumstance, ultimately destroyed the Republic they both claimed to serve. But from the ashes of their conflict rose an empire, a new dawn for Rome, forever shaped by the lives and legacies of these two unforgettable titans. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We hope it has been a fascinating journey into the heart of ancient Rome. If you've enjoyed this long-form history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the past. Your support means the world to us. As you drift into sleep, ponder the profound currents of history that shape our world. And please join us again for another nighttime history journey. Good night.